Well, welcome to today's episode. We're so lucky to have on Dr. Matt Duerden. Matt received his master's from BYU and then his PhD from Texas A&M. His experience design research focuses on memorable, meaningful, and transformative experiences, and his publications have appeared in a variety of journals. Matt has also co-authored a book which is called Designing Experiences. Matt's currently a professor of experience design and management in the Marriott School of Business at BYU and teaches at the undergraduate and MBA level. He works with organizations across a variety of sectors, including healthcare, education, not for profit, tourism, manufacturing, and consumer product goods to provide training and consulting around experience design. Matt is also a part of the founding circle of the World Experience Organization and is a member of the Experience Research Society's executive committee. And when Matt isn't at work, he loves spending time outdoors with his wife and their four children. Welcome to the show, Matt. Thanks so much for hopping on.
Yeah, this is awesome. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, I know we connected a few years back in your experience design. I think it was 404 class for the
Uh-huh.
junior cohort, and just loved your class and glad that we can continue to be friends um, and chat now. It's been awesome.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. And one of the things that I love about teaching is seeing students where they go and what they do after they graduate. So it's fun to keep that connection going.
Yeah, I mean everyone just talks about how much they love you, so it's great to see you connect with so many experience design students and also some honor students as well. Before we jump into storytelling and transformational experiences, um, I guess could you kind of briefly go over what you do teach at BYU right now?
Sure. So I teach, as you mentioned, I teach e- experience design and management 404, which is the experience design course that students take when they are accepted into our major. So we have about 130-ish students that come into the program each fall, and they take, among other things, my course, where we get them comfortable with sort of concepts of what our experience is, what's experience design, and then key competencies, including design thinking, human-centered design approaches, experience mapping, thinking about touch point design, and just trying to give them sort of the conceptual and also some of the design and experience design tools that they're going to apply in a variety of ways throughout their time in the program. And then I teach a version of that course depending on the year in the undergrad, in the daytime MBA program, and as well as the executive MBA program at BYU. And then with my colleague and good friend, Dr. Jamin Rowan, who's in English, we co-teach a class in the honors program called the Art of Transformative Storytelling. So Jamin and I have co-directed BYU's London Center twice. And through that process of just thinking about interdisciplinarity and how to increase students' curiosity and creativity, which we see as core lifelong learning competencies, we settled on this space around storytelling as a problem-solving tool. Not just, it's funny, sometimes we'll have students who don't read the full description of our course and think they're going to learn how to write fiction novels. But what we're really interested in is helping students understand the components of good stories and then allowing them to articulate personal experiences that they've had into story formats. And that's important and applicable across a variety of spaces, right? Whether it's a job interview or some type of public speaking, or really probably most important, just making sense of your own experiences to yourself and others. And that's sort of our hypothesis, is that individuals who can articulate what they have experienced to themselves and others are more likely to be transformed and nudge other people to transformation by telling those stories. So we see it as an experiential competency.
I love that, and I think you're right. Storytelling, like on the surface, it seems like writing fiction, but in reality, it has a lot of application in personal lives and in our careers. Were you always interested in storytelling throughout your career, or what was there anything that kind of sparked a curiosity into that field, or
It's probably, I don't think it's something that I've always been interested in. Um, but probably a decade ago, as I started looking more into transformative experience and my research and teaching, uh, trying to one of the conversations I remember having with a couple of people is how stories are often about transformation, right? And so we just started thinking about like classic stories we just did through the holiday season, and thinking about A Christmas Carol, right? We love that story, this transformational experience that Ebenezer Scrooge goes through, and just thinking about, what are the components that are often touched on in stories, when we're talking about individuals transforming. And then as I became it just kept popping up in a variety of places. I think storytelling has become an increasingly popular topic, whether that's thinking about the hero's journey or the stories that brands tell. But I read a book called The Power of Meaning by Emily Esfahani Smith, um, probably like 5 or 6 years ago. And in it, she makes the case that there are four, I think, primary sources from which we derive meaning in life. And when we struggle with meaning, that's what underlies a lot of whether that's mental health issues or identity issues. It's not necessarily that we want to be happy all the time, but we do want to have meaning. And I was struck when I read that book that one of the sources of meaning that she talks about was storytelling, which I thought, oh, that's sort of interesting if you were just to pick four. But she makes this case that we're hardwired to tell stories, and that it's how we've always made sense of the world around us and our place in it. And when we struggle to articulate that story about how we fit and where we have been and where we currently are and where we're going and how we're making an impact, like we struggle, and when we can't articulate that story. So I just started thinking more and more about it and began to see more intersections with my interest in how experiences are designed. I think the best experiences often follow a narrative arc. If we think about sort of a traditional narrative arc, and then started co-teaching a bunch with somebody in English, and the more that we talked and recognized common interests, that decided to teach the course in storytelling.
Yeah, I definitely think that storytelling connects a speaker and a listener. It definitely brings meaning to the listener and helps them see where they might. I guess some of the best leaders in history, including Jesus Christ, whether you're religious or not, like they teach in parables, they teach in stories because people can relate to those and see themselves in those.
And I think to your point that you mentioned about like the connection between a teller and the listener of a story, I think that's one of the things that's been most profound for us in teaching the course, because we start off by having students identify a need that they have, not like something that, like when I was 10, I had this, was on a hike and slipped and was hanging from a cliff, and not like this like need that's already been wrapped up and there's sort of a clear, like everything worked out, and um but like a need that they continue to carry with them, and to tell a story, sort of this autobiographical story about their need and navigating how they have tried to meet that need, and often not always succeeded, right? These are often end up being stories that are very vulnerable. And what we've seen is it creates a really interesting classroom dynamic, unlike any other classes that I've experienced, where people see each other really clearly as people, as opposed to just somebody in a class, that they've been able to see a little bit into this individual soul, so to speak. And I think especially stories where individuals are willing to be vulnerable, it just causes us to lean in. And even though somebody's experience is unique to them, that degree of vulnerability often allows us as a listener to make a connection and say, okay, I haven't had that exact experience, but I felt those emotions before, and I can have that sort of empathetic connection, and that changes a lot of things. So connection, and we're actually starting. We've done a preliminary study, but we're doing some studies moving forward, working with Dr. Dan Dewey in the linguistics department and Dr. Camilla Hodge in my department, looking at how our brains perform or neurological functioning when stories are being told and listened to, using some cool like brain scanning technology to try to look at that connection piece and what's called neurosynchronicity, when brain functioning across multiple individuals starts mirroring each other, right? And think about it as like group flow, for example.
Yeah, that's interesting. 'Cause whenever someone tells a story, especially one that involves quite a bit of vulnerability in telling it, you see people kind of scoot to the edge of their seat. They look very engaged. So it'd be cool to also see what's going on internally as someone's telling a story, like, and the science behind that. That'll be interesting to see what you guys find.
Totally, because there's a variety of story structures, but we know when we hear a story, we've heard enough stories, and it's how we communicate, that we do sort of lean in, right? Because we know that there's going to be some type of payoff at the end, right? Whether that's a joke or an insight or a twist. Yeah, but we lean in, right? You watch audiences, anytime you're in sort of a large group setting and the speaker starts telling a story, they always get more eyeballs.
Definitely. You mentioned a few structures. I know you mentioned the hero's journey, and you might talk a little bit more about that later on. But what are some of the elements that constitute a good story? Like what do most good stories include, and where do most good stories maybe end?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, you're going to have differences in terms of the structure, and you're going to have, depending on the culture, whether it's anyways, I mean, this is a whole topic we could talk a ton about and quickly get out of my depth. Um, but in terms of teaching about stories and looking at how to help students develop stories, and then see how that spilled over into my work and experience design, there are a few like primary components. So the first one, and I think the core foundational one, and this is where storytelling and experience design really connects, is a need, right? So stories are about a specific need that an individual or a group of people has. And the best designed experiences are those that are connected to a need that people have, right? And there are, from a self-determination theory perspective, we know that like the three main psychological needs are sense of autonomy, or you have control in your life, sense of relatedness, you feel connected to people around you, a sense of competence, right? So often the needs are connected to one of those three big categories, but they could be a variety of different things. We all have needs. And then the story, when a story, a good story is about a need and an individual's experience sort of navigating complications and obstacles to having that need met. And then the insights that they gain along the way. And it's usually, I think, the most interesting stories aren't, I went to work, I was hungry, so I got some food and it was good, right? I mean, that's still like there's a person and there was a need and there was a resolution, but it's not always about sort of a sitcom ending where everything is like tied up with a nice bow. A lot of the stories that we hear students tell in our class are about like hard things they're still figuring out, but that vulnerability really draws people in. So you've got a need, you've got complications, and insights. Those are the three big necessary components. And then in addition to that, stories require specific details, right? So the more specific the need is, the better, the more specific the insight. But also thinking about, like, how do you tell the stories? It just this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. As a storyteller, our job is to curate specific scenes from the available information, right? And so those scenes that introduce a character, that introduce a need, that introduce complications, that introduce the insight, being really particular about what those are and giving details. I think it's much easier for a listener to be able to sort of build a picture in their mind if we're giving them specific details about where this took place, what people were wearing, what people were saying, like specific details about the setting and the sounds, the smells, like drawing people in, so that those scenes are really intentionally picked to do that job of introducing the character, introducing the need. And then in addition to that, thinking about like the sequencing of those, like some stories, it does make sense to just like this happened and then this happened and then this happened. But it's often more interesting to have a scene and then have some type of flashback, or have a braided narrative where you have sort of two stories that connect to each other, but you're bouncing back and forth between those. And there's a lot of different ways to do that. But all of that should be done in order to introduce the need, complication, and insight.
Really quick, I want to go back to, I guess, how everyone has needs that you're like telling the stories to, whether it be in a class presentation, a work meeting, um, or anything in your personal life. I think something as experienced designers that we learn a lot about, and that is just a really useful skill, is really trying to ask yourself, like, what does my audience need? What are they going through currently? Or if you're getting a talk in a church congregation, what might people be feeling? And being very intentional with how you tell a story with that need in mind, I think is a pretty cool idea. Like, you're kind of catering maybe one story to a very, very specific audience, and you might tell it differently to another audience at a
Totally.
different
Yeah.
time as well.
Yeah. And what's interesting, like to bring this back to experience design, at the end of the semester in this class, so the first half they're doing sort of individual stories, and then we have this story slam event where they come and everybody tells their 6 minute story. Then we transition into the group phase of the class where they're paired up in groups of like 4 to 6, and they have to identify a subculture, and we often will have it be a subculture connected to BYU. And then they go out and try to learn about the subculture. They collect stories from people in the subculture. So, we had students looking at students for whom English was a second language, or BYU students who had been divorced, or students who had or were waiting for an organ transplant, right? We try to get into like a very specific group. They go out and collect these stories. From these stories, try to then articulate as specifically as possible what is that need, right? It's not just, there's like functional needs of like, if you've got an organ transplant, or if you're waiting for an organ, like obviously that's your need. But there's also like a need connected to just figuring out like how to navigate waiting when you need something. Like, this complication is so unique. And if you're a student at BYU and you've gone through a divorce, right, there's needs for like social acceptance, but there's different sort of things and barriers and obstacles to that, right? So there's these individual sort of specific versions of these needs for these subgroups, and then the groups have to then design an immersive experience to help other people, in essence, like trip over the truth of what this group's experience is like, what their needs and complications are like, in order to develop more empathy with individuals in that circumstance. And so we sort of like use the stories and what we learn about stories that then design experiences to bring people to specific insights connected to that subgroup.
I love that. And a thought, because you mentioned trip over the truth, and I know that's comes from Dan and Chip Heath's Power of Moments book. I'm not
Right.
sure if that might come from other places as well, but
Yeah, but they definitely
I
talk about it. Yeah.
I think, but before we try to kind of like plan out a great story or plan out a great experience for people, it is so important that we spend more time at the beginning really trying to understand the people we're trying to help or work with. I think a lot of the time, myself and probably a lot of others, like when we have this great story, or we have this great idea for an experience or a product, we kind of get hung up really early on about like, this idea is so great, but like, and we kind of lose that focus on the person that we're trying to help and like their individual needs. So I think it was your class actually where you shared the Albert Einstein quote, like if you have like if I had 90 or an hour to like come up with a solution to save the world or something, I'd spend 55 minutes trying to understand it, and then 5 minutes like trying to design the solution.
Yeah.
Was it something along the lines of that?
Yeah, something like, and whether that's like he actually said that or it's apocryphal, I love like the truth in that of how, and this is something that I have increasingly become aware of how important it is. I think I feel much more passionate about this than I did 5 years ago, because I just continually see the importance of like nailing the need and being really specific about the need. And it's almost in some instances the most important thing that will come out of a project, whether that's a story or you're designing an experience. And it's true that we like to just jump to solutions because it feels like there's some sense of like completing or like progressing if we're able to come up with a solution. But we've got to take the time to figure out the need and also be willing to like reframe that need. And it's interesting in this honors class. I mean, this happens in my experience design classes as well. But I think especially in the honors class, we have to continually tell the students at the beginning, because a lot of them, like on the first or second day of class, are like, "Oh yeah, I got the story I'm going to tell. This is my story that I always tell at parties or whatever." And I think most of them don't believe us. We're like, "No, like that's like you don't know the story yet. Like we've got to go through this process, and you're going to like revise it and work on it and get to a place where you're going to have something really interesting to say." And what happens with a number of students every semester is at some point in the process, they're like, "Oh, I actually know the story I should probably tell, but it's making me feel a little bit uncomfortable, right? This is something that requires a little bit more vulnerability." But man, those stories when students are willing to tell about their own personal experiences of transformation, and to be vulnerable with that, it's really, really powerful.
Yeah, that must be so cool to be able to hear tons of different perspectives and stories every semester.
Yeah, it's really amazing. It's become like a sacred experience in a lot of ways to just be in this space with people. And we're actually right now trying to figure out how to bring this to the broader university community. We'd love to have some type of like BYU Story Slam where we have a sort of a workshop format. We don't want people to just come off the street and like, I've got a story to tell, but go through a process of sort of developing and workshopping stories and then have forums to share these stories. Because going back to what we talked about in terms of connection, we see stories, especially stories of people being vulnerable and talking about things that are important to them, are a way to build connection and belonging. And you know, as President Reese, who's the president of Brigham Young University, talks a lot about this idea of becoming BYU, I think part of that process is going to be people sharing and listening to each other's stories and finding commonalities.
Definitely. That actually reminds me of I had a professor named Wade Jacoby. He taught in the political science department, and he sadly passed away a few years back. But I remember one time we were talking about political polarization in his office because I was just really curious about it, and he quoted Bryan Stevenson, who's like the civil rights really good justice leader, wrote a book called Just Mercy that's great. And this professor Jacoby, he talked about this line from Bryan Stevenson that was like, it's really hard to hate someone like when you have proximity to them. And I think the way that we get proximity to people, in whether it's communities that we don't have a lot of contact with right now, or really just anyone in our lives, is to hear their perspective, to hear their stories, and yeah, create like what you guys are doing, create places where those stories can be shared with each other and where you can connect and unify. And I think that'll be really important going forward because I know there's just with everything, there's just polarization everywhere. So it's so important to create forums where you can share those different perspectives, your own stories, and connect because we have a lot more in common than not. But I think we kind of forget that sometimes.
Yeah, I love that point, and I love that insight from Bryan Stevenson, because it's true, right? I think there is a small number of sort of core human needs, like we talked about, and although we have unique experiences, each one of us, and the way we sort of navigate and work our way through life. Really what's driving us are needs that aren't that different, right? And so when you hear somebody's story who you may think, man, we don't have anything in common, it often becomes pretty easy to say, oh, actually, yeah, even though our lives are completely different, like I totally get what it feels like to have this happen, or something else happen that's hard or good, right? And so I totally agree, right? I totally agree, because it strips away like facades and prejudices and allows us to just have this more connection as humans, really, which I think is really, really important. And I think this is one of the pitfalls with social media, is that it is a space that can be used to tell stories, but so often it's in a sort of a manicured way that doesn't present us three-dimensionally, and so it can actually lead to more tribalism than connecting us.
Yeah, definitely. I'm curious, staying on storytelling a bit, but changing lanes on it. Some stories definitely have the power to transform us, and others are just kind of there. You mentioned like sitcoms are kind of like pretty flat stories, and like a lot of us will watch shows like The Office or Parks and Rec, and we kind of it's nice to be able to relate to like, oh, like my life's pretty boring day to day like that. But then we'll watch movies or shows such as I think The Secret Life of Walter Mitty is a great movie about really like transformation through where the character's completely different at the end of the movie than he was at the beginning. Um, I guess why can stories help transform people, and how do we kind of intentionally design stories that have the power to transform people? I know we talked about focusing on the needs of um, those that we're talking with as one of the ways to do that.
Well, and yeah, I think to your point, not every story needs to be transformative, right? Um, we, in essence, hire stories to do different jobs for us, both when we tell them and when we listen to them, right? So a lot of my research looks at trying to differentiate between memorable, meaningful, and transformative experiences, as you mentioned at the outset. And the way that I think about that is the impacts of those different types of experiences. So memorable experiences, the primary impact are emotions, right? And meaningful experiences are emotions plus insight, like personally relevant insights, right? So not only do we feel something, but we also learn something about ourselves or the world around us or somebody else. And then finally, transformative experiences, the impact is around emotion, insight, and then change. And often that's like a small t transformation, right? We have a attitudinal change, or we have a perspective change, right? And a lot of times that change doesn't manifest until later, right? It's not immediate in the experience. And a lot of times when we feel like we're changed in the moment, that dissipates over time. And then very rarely we have sort of big T transformation moments. And those I don't think happen too often in life, where in the moment we are radically changed in some way that is also like maintains over time. But I think if we're thinking about stories, right? If we just want, sometimes we do want to just feel emotion, right? And it's interesting too. We don't always just want to feel positive emotion, right? We pay money to go see movies that are scary or sad, right? So I think as humans, experiencing a richness and diversity of emotions is really like good for us. And then there's stories that provide insight, right? It's not just about the emotion we're feeling, but there's something that we learn or gain a new understanding about something. And so the story isn't just meant to entertain, but it's also meant to sort of educate and inform. And then sometimes that will then spill over into actually feeling like I've been changed or I want to change in some way or another, right? So I think about like Just Mercy, right? That book or the movie, I think that was very insightful, meaningful for many people, and transformational for some, right? And it had this, again, a story about, in essence, individuals and their need, and then the complications they felt, right, or faced, right? Whether that was unjustly being incarcerated or being in a life situation where they were dealing with things that for most of us we never have to face, and then being placed inside of a system that wasn't taking into consideration their needs or even like value as human beings, and then somebody like recognizing that and stepping in and fighting for change in those situations, like that's like a pretty powerful story. So I think going back to those elements is like, what's the need, what are the complications, and what are the insights, and the flavor of each of those are going to determine, I think, the type of experience listeners will have as they hear a story, right? Because you may tell something that you think is transformative that's only, memorable for somebody else, or something that's memorable for you might be transformational for other people, or meaningful for you and ordinary, right? So that's a co-created thing, between the storyteller and the story listener.
I love what you said, and that's actually kind of a natural transition into transformational experiences and also meaningful experiences, because what's memorable or meaningful or transformational for one might not be for another. I guess as an experienced designer, is it when you're trying to design like a transformational experience, whether it be in a consulting project or for your family, even, how do you like, if you're trying to have a transformational experience for your family, let's say, like, how do you get as close to that for everyone as you can? Or do you just kind of accept, like, like this is going to be what it is? It could be very meaningful, or it could be very transformative. Um, I don't
Yeah,
know
I
how
mean,
much
I
thought goes
think
into that,
designing
but
for trans, yeah, I think designing for transformation is really like complicated because experiencers are co-created, especially like with a family. You're going to have a lot of different needs, um, in that situation, right? You're going to have, if you have different ages of kids, and everybody has different interests and things. So again, it goes back to understanding like, what are the needs? Are there common needs? Are there individual needs? How do I address some of those, maybe not others? In some situations, you may design experiences to not meet certain needs, right? Like you may go do something really hard where people are hungry and tired and have to sleep outside on the ground because you want them to connect through shared struggle, right? So I think it goes back to thinking about, yeah, what are the needs? And I think this is one of the reasons why like vacations can be a really powerful uh, experience for families, because you take people out of their normal context, where as a thinking from a parent's perspective, if you're thinking that you want to create more cohesion between your family, there's a lot of things when you're at home that can make that hard. Busy schedules, family sort of roles, just not like seeing each other as you go through your busy day, and you take everybody out of that context and have them do something else where those distractions are removed. It can potentially create opportunities to build relationships and have a shared experience, especially if there are some additional sort of novelty and challenges built into that situation, allowed to build shared memories in a way that is unique. Yeah, so that's one way to think about it.
for a moment, could you touch more on like the novelty and challenge side of things? Because I know in the past I've heard you talk quite a bit about, you worked in river rafting for a while, and how you'd see kind of people grow a lot closer together and like make these meaningful connections. And I think of like memorable experiences with, whether it be a work party or with my family, where we'd go out and go see a movie, or we'd go to Top Golf and hit a few golf balls, and like it's definitely a fun time, and we can joke about it later on. But there's definitely experiences I think of, like Trek, which is like a kind of a church trip that we used to go on, where we'd have to hike for 3 straight days, and it was just super hot and miserable. But like I felt very changed after, and most people would feel very changed after. And it just is something that you talk about for years and years on end. Like, can you talk
Yeah,
about maybe
totally.
the role of novelty and challenge in that?
Yeah, totally. Um, Okay, so to answer your question, I think there are a variety of design strategies when we're thinking about creating a hope for transformative experience. And then there's also participant competencies that are important as well, right? Again, experiences are co-created. And so I think as a designer, once we have a sense of this is the type of experience, this is the need, perhaps we want to increase cohesion or increase communication, we begin thinking about, design strategies. So if we want um, to create a shared experience where people have to rely on each other, we're going to design some complications, right? Those could be physical complications, those could be, uh, just changing rules of a situation, right? Games are basically just like different rules that act as constraints that, uh, we have to navigate to try to win the game, right? For example. And so you want to, you potentially can create opportunities where people have to work together to reach some sort of end, right? So some type of shared struggle where people are relying on each other. Novelty is like an experience design spice. You don't want to use too much of it, and you don't want to always rely on it. Um, but it can allow people to focus more on the immediate experience if they're in a context that is novel or they're doing something that's novel. Too much novelty can cause anxiety and distract people. But if what you're trying to do is capture attention, novelty can be really helpful. Our brains are hardwired to recognize novelty. Um, and so when something is new, we just pay more attention. This is why from like a human-centered design saying is think like a traveler or think like a novice, right? Like let go of your assumptions and like what is like be more observant of your surroundings and how people are interacting in whatever space you're observing. um, so novelty and challenge can be really helpful. There's research that suggests that feeling the emotion of awe is often a precursor to change, which is triggered a lot of times by just this sense of like, wow, I am like a small speck in this big, expansive universe. It's like not like I'm not important, but just this sense of like how big the world is. This is what astronauts talk about being in space and looking back at the Earth, or going to a beautiful natural space and seeing the Grand Canyon for the first time, or hearing like an amazing live music performance and just like, wow, this is like U2 in the Sphere in Vegas or something, where it's just like the immensity of the experience. So there's a variety of things on the designer side, but then you also have to think about what are the knowledge and competencies that your participants are going to need to have, right? Because if you want somebody, if you want to use physical challenge, there needs to be a certain degree of competency, or people are going to feel anxiety, or if it's too easy, they're going to feel bored, right? From a flow perspective. So it's thinking about in before an experience happens, what do I need to do to prepare people so that they're able to anticipate and be primed with the emotions I want them to have, so then that when the experience starts, they're paying attention, they're engaging in that, and that they have sort of the knowledge and competencies to do so. And then I think most importantly, perhaps, is what are you doing after the experience? Because especially if it's novel, if it is working with a group of people that they're not going to be around with once they go home, or they're going back into different roles, you've got to help them be able to unpack that experience. And this is where we get back to storytelling, unpack that experience in a way that they're able to make connections, reintegrate it back with who they are at home, see how it generalizes. If you can facilitate opportunities for people who participate in the experience to like talk about it together, to keep those memories alive and integrated once the experience is over.
Yeah, kind of two thoughts as we get closer to wrapping up. I think the overarching theme of what we talked about with storytelling and transformative experiences is the fact that you really need to know who you're designing for, who you're telling a story to. Because, like, yeah, if you don't know someone's competencies, you're not going to be able to design a great experience for them. Like if my
Right.
roommate decided to take me out skiing for the weekend, it'd be a miserable experience for me because like it's just not where my skill is compared to where
Yeah.
his is. But if you truly know who you're designing for, you could know what some of their strengths, what some of their weaknesses are, and what their needs are ultimately. And it sounds like you just have to be very intentional when you're designing, whether it's stories for people or whether experiences. You'll be much more successful in those things, whether it's in work or in your personal life, if you truly know and truly care about and have
Yeah.
empathy for those you're designing for.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
definitely. Yeah, I think you've summed that up really well.
the second thing, and which I think is really interesting, because you always talk about in experiences, there's anticipation, there's participation, and then reflection stages.
Right.
And I think for transformative experiences, especially that reflection stage is so important. I know, actually, this was just yesterday. I worked at FSY like a year and a half ago, and I was in a group chat with a few people in it, and they're trying, the church now is trying to have these stakes do kind of FSY like debriefs like 6 or 7 months later now, trying to have the youth kind of remember their experiences at FSY. And I
Yeah,
think that that
interesting.
also plays a huge
Interesting.
role in
Yeah,
transformative experiences, is bringing those emotions back up and like,
totally. Yep.
yeah. As we kind of wrap up, do you have any other thoughts on whether it be storytelling or transformative experiences that you think?
No, I think I really enjoy like how you've led us through this conversation. It's been super fun talking about these topics and their intersection.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining it, Matt. It's always good talking to you.